August 30th, 1945. The Pacific lay gray and endless, the water beaten flat by wind and a war that had finally ended. On the deck of a U.S. Navy transport ship, a cluster of Japanese women stood huddled in their thin clothes, their eyes wide, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of the sea. Some were nurses captured on Pacific islands, others clerks or civilians who had been swept into the chaos of surrender. Their faces were pale, framed by dark hair knotted carelessly, and their expressions carried the exhaustion of a nation broken. They had grown up on posters that painted Americans as cruel beasts, demons with claws and fangs, yet now they found themselves guarded by young men in pressed khaki, men who spoke in unfamiliar accents, men who neither spat at them nor struck them, but instead offered cigarettes or water as if to strangers, not enemies. The women could hardly reconcile the scene before them with the warnings drilled into them through years of propaganda. The ship creaked as it cut toward the American coast, carrying the weight of surrender across the ocean. The women were silent at first, their bodies close, their breaths visible in the cool morning air. Some clutched the remnants of possessions, worn satchels, faded photographs, a folded kimono hidden under military-issued blankets. Each woman carried with her not just belongings, but a story of how she had survived capture. One, a nurse of 28, had been stationed in a field hospital on Saipan, where she watched friends leap from cliffs rather than fall into American hands. Another, barely 21, had been working as a typist in a garrison office when U.S. troops surrounded the island. A third, older than the rest, had been caring for children in a missionary compound when surrender swept them all into captivity. Their journeys were different, but they shared the same dread: what awaited them in the enemy's land. The Americans on board were boys, many no older than the women themselves. Farm sons from Iowa, steel workers from Pennsylvania, baseball players from Texas, now transformed into sailors and guards. They walked the deck with casual authority, rifles slung loosely, smiles flickering when they caught the POWs staring at them. One soldier, amused, held out a Lucky Strike cigarette, tapping the pack with 2 fingers before extending it like a peace offering. The women recoiled at first, unsure if it was a trick. When one finally accepted, her hands trembling, the soldier only nodded and lit it for her. It was a simple gesture, but it cracked something in the wall of fear built up over years of indoctrination. These were not monsters. They were, unsettlingly, just men. The sea voyage was long, and time aboard the transport blurred. Meals arrived at regular intervals, trays of bread, soup, sometimes even meat. The women were stunned by the abundance, though some could not swallow it, their stomachs knotted by nerves. Nights were colder, the bunks hard, and whispers filled the dark as they tried to make sense of where they were headed. A few whispered rumors. California, maybe Texas, places whose names sounded foreign and enormous. None had seen America, though many had heard of it as a land of arrogance, skyscrapers, and endless machines. To imagine themselves within it was as impossible as imagining peace after years of air raids and rationing. Yet the most unsettling realization came not from fear of what awaited, but from the sight of the Americans themselves. Compared to the men the women had known in Japan, thin from rice shortages, hollowed by years of conflict, the Americans seemed impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, filled with energy. Their uniforms fit easily, their boots shined, their laughter rose above the wind. The women watched them secretly, astonished at their health. They had been told Americans were decadent and weak, soft from luxury. But these men, with their clear eyes and athletic builds, seemed anything but weak. The contradiction gnawed at them, a silent wound to their sense of truth. One evening, as the sun burned red against the horizon, the nurse from Saipan stood at the railing, staring at the glowing line where water met sky. An American sailor, barely older than 20, leaned a few steps away, smoking. For a long time, they shared the silence, 2 figures from opposite worlds. When the sailor finally spoke, his voice was gentle, almost shy. "You'll be safe there." She did not understand his words, but his tone carried something she did. not menace, not hatred, perhaps even kindness. She turned away quickly, unsettled by how human it sounded. Inside the cabins, conversations grew bolder. One young woman whispered that the guards looked like actors from American films she had glimpsed before the war. Another said she thought their smiles were frightening, too open, too free. A third admitted that the tall soldiers made her feel invisible, like a child. They laughed nervously, but beneath the laughter lay unease. If everything they had been told was false, what else was a lie? If the enemy was not grotesque but handsome, not vicious but courteous, then what had all the suffering been for? Their minds wrestled with questions they could not yet answer. The days passed, marked by bells and meals, the endless hiss of the ocean. Slowly, the women adjusted, though fear never left entirely. They noticed details now. The way the Americans teased each other, the way one whistled a tune while polishing his boots, the way another prayed quietly at night, head bowed. Such ordinary acts seemed extraordinary. The women had been prepared for cruelty, yet instead they saw rituals of normal life. It was disarming, confusing, and strangely painful, for it reminded them of what their own brothers and husbands might have been if war had not consumed everything. On the morning of August 30th, the shoreline finally appeared, a faint line, then a shape, then the unmistakable outline of America. The women pressed to the rails, their hearts quickening. For some, fear surged again. What trials awaited in this vast enemy land? For others, curiosity flared. The tall guards stood near them, gazing toward home, their postures easy, as if they were returning from a long shift rather than ending a world war. The contrast was almost unbearable. The prisoners were crossing into a land they had been taught to hate, a land that would now decide their fates. Yet standing beside them were men whose very presence contradicted every warning and caricature they had believed. The ship groaned as it neared the harbor, gulls circling above, the air sharper with the scent of land. One of the women, clutching her satchel, whispered to the nurse beside her, "If they are not monsters, then what are they?" It was a question heavy with both dread and wonder. The nurse had no answer. She only stared at the American docks rising from the horizon, where more soldiers waited, taller, broader, cleaner than she had imagined. Her pulse quickened. The journey across the ocean was ending, but the greater journey was only beginning. For what awaited them on American soil was not brutality, but something far stranger, and perhaps even more unsettling. The harbor rose from the mist like a promise and a threat. Wooden piers stretched into the water, cranes swung lazily overhead, and the smell of oil, salt, and coal drifted toward the transport ship as it eased closer to land. For the Japanese women on deck, every detail carved itself into memory. They clutched their satchels and stared through the fog at the figures gathering along the docks. Rows of American soldiers stood waiting, their uniforms pressed, rifles resting casually, their posture steady but not cruel. The women drew in sharp breath. It was their first true sight of America, and it was nothing like the grotesque drawings that had filled their wartime newspapers. In those papers, the enemy had been portrayed as hunched, bestial, faces twisted with malice. Yet here, standing in the sunlight, the Americans were tall, clean, broad of shoulder. Their hair gleamed in shades the women rarely saw, brown, blonde, even red. Their jaws were sharp, their eyes startlingly clear. They did not look starved or sickly. They looked strong, like men born from fields of abundance. One young woman whispered to another, her voice trembling as though admitting a crime, "They are handsome." The word felt dangerous on her tongue, as if even acknowledging it betrayed something sacred. But the others heard her, and though none replied, the silence carried a quiet agreement. The guards on the ship barked orders in English, signaling the women to prepare for disembarkation. Boots clanged on metal stairways, ropes tightened, and the ship shuddered against the pier. One by one, the women descended the gangway, their heads bowed though their eyes darted forward, stealing glances at the soldiers who lined the path. The Americans towered over them. The average Japanese man in the 1940s stood little more than 5 feet 3, These guards, nourished on beef and milk, reached 5'8", 5'9", sometimes taller. The women felt the scale of the difference not only in height but in the confidence of their bearing. It was as though they had stepped into a land where men were giants. The Americans watched silently, some with curiosity, others with polite detachment. A few whispered to each other, but there was no cruelty in their eyes, no jeering. One soldier, no older than 20, shifted his weight nervously when a Japanese nurse glanced up at him. Their gazes met for an instant, and she felt a heat rise to her face. The shame of it startled her. How could she notice such a thing here, as a prisoner? She looked away quickly, yet the image of his face, clean-shaven, unscarred, impossibly youthful, seared itself into her thoughts. At the foot of the gangway, the women were guided into rows. Trucks waited nearby, their engines rumbling, ready to carry them inland. American officers walked among them, checking lists, counting softly. The process was efficient, clinical, yet beneath it lingered something unexpected, a faint courtesy. An officer gestured for one woman to adjust her satchel so it would not fall, his hand careful not to touch her. Another spoke slowly, pointing to the truck she should enter, his tone patient. These were gestures that contradicted every story told in Japan, where the enemy was said to spit on captives and treat them worse than cattle. The women's hearts raced with the strangeness of it. As the trucks jolted forward, the city unfolded before them. Streets stretched wide, lined with warehouses and cranes. The sky was streaked with soot, but in between hung the sharp brightness of neon signs, English letters glowing in colors they could scarcely read. Cars passed by, their engines smooth, their chrome gleaming. America, even in a port still marked by wartime effort, looked alive, vigorous. The women pressed their faces to the slats of the truck bed, astonished. In Japan, cities lay in ruins. Tokyo a field of ash, Osaka scorched, Nagoya shattered. Here, buildings still stood tall, and the rhythm of industry hummed as though the war had brushed past but never broken it. The nurse from Saipan thought of her younger brother, who had died of malnutrition 2 years earlier. She thought of his small frame, his thin wrists, the way hunger had dulled his eyes. Then she looked again at the Americans driving the trucks, broad backs, thick arms, laughter slipping easily between them. She felt something twist inside her, a mixture of envy, grief, and wonder. If the enemy had lived like this, had they ever truly known the same war? The trucks rolled inland toward the camps that awaited. On the way, American civilians glimpsed the convoy. Children stood barefoot at the roadside, waving with curiosity. Some adults watched quietly, arms folded, neither welcoming nor hostile, only cautious. The women shrank from their gazes, but what startled them most was not hatred, it was indifference. They were not spectacles to be mocked or paraded, they were simply another part of the war's aftermath. That anonymity was both relief and sting. To be invisible was safer, yet it also reminded them how powerless they had become. Inside the truck, whispers spread. A 21-year-old clerk leaned toward the nurse, her voice barely audible. "They look like film stars." The nurse frowned, but the younger woman's eyes shone with nervous awe. Another older woman snapped softly, "Do not speak of such things." Yet even she could not deny what they all felt. The men around them, clean, tall, and steady, were not the caricatures of propaganda. They were, in a way that unsettled them deeply, admirable. The convoy reached the edges of the countryside. Fields stretched wide, green and golden under the sun. Farmhouses dotted the land, their porches lined with rocking chairs, their barns painted bright red. The women stared in silence. This, too, was America. Fertile, unscarred by firebombs, a land that seemed to grow strength in its very soil. The contrast to their own villages, scorched and empty, was unbearable. Some felt tears sting their eyes, though they quickly hid them. By the time the trucks slowed at the camp gates, the women's minds churned with contradiction. They had been told to expect cruelty, yet met with courtesy. They had been warned of monsters, yet found men who looked like athletes, farmers, actors. They had imagined America as a wasteland of arrogance, yet now saw fields and cities untouched by ruin. Each glimpse of abundance made their own losses heavier. Each tall soldier reminded them of brothers buried in shallow graves. As they were led through the gates, a final moment struck them. The American guards exchanged laughter among themselves, tossing a baseball back and forth while waiting for orders. The ball arced high in the afternoon light, caught easily by hands that seemed unshaken by war. The women stopped briefly, watching. To them, it was more than a game. It was proof of something terrifying and alluring, that America had endured with its vigor intact, while Japan had crumbled into ashes. The nurse clutched her satchel, her eyes fixed on the ball as it sailed through the air again. For the first time, she felt the full depth of the question clawing at all of them. If everything they had believed was false, then what truths would this land force them to face? The ball snapped into the soldier's glove with a soft smack, and the women were ushered forward. What lay inside the camp would challenge them even more than the sight of handsome men on the docks. The gates clanged shut behind them, but what lay inside was not the grim barracks of their imagination. The American camp stretched across rolling fields, its wooden huts neat and aligned like rows of barns, its fences tall but not menacing. Guards walked the perimeter with rifles resting lazily on their shoulders, their expressions more bored than brutal. The women clutched their satchels and stepped across gravel paths that crunched underfoot, their hearts beating in disbelief. They had expected darkness, cruelty, cages. Instead they found order, cleanliness, and a faint smell of baking bread drifting from the kitchens. On the first morning, they were woken not by shouts but by a bell that rang through the camp like a schoolyard chime. They lined up hesitantly for breakfast, each tray filled with things almost unthinkable after years of scarcity. Scrambled eggs, bread thick with butter, even bacon sizzling on tin plates. The younger women stared at the food, unable to believe it was truly theirs. One nurse whispered to the clerk beside her, "This would feed a family for a week in Tokyo." The clerk only nodded, her eyes brimming. For months they had lived on thin rice gruel, on weeds boiled in water. Here, in the enemy's land, they were handed more than they had dared to imagine. Some wept silently as they ate, ashamed that their first tears in captivity came not from cruelty but from kindness. Life inside the camp unfolded with an unexpected rhythm. Each day followed a schedule: meals, roll calls, medical checks, work details for those willing. The women were given uniforms of plain fabric, neither demeaning nor harsh, just clothing sturdy enough for chores. They were housed in separate barracks from the men, their quarters lined with wooden bunks and thin mattresses. At night, whispers filled the darkness, questions of home, fragments of memory, confessions of disbelief. They spoke of husbands lost, of brothers who had marched into jungles and never returned, of children they might never see again. And always, beneath the grief, came the same astonishment. Why were they being treated with dignity in the land of their conquerors? The Americans, too, seemed uncertain. Guards approached with politeness, handing out soap, showing where the showers were, explaining, slowly, sometimes with gestures, how to use unfamiliar things. One soldier laughed gently when a woman stared in wonder at hot water gushing from a tap. "It's just plumbing," he said, not realizing the miracle of it for those who had endured years of rationing. Another time, when one woman struggled to carry a crate, a guard stepped forward, taking it from her hands with a sheepish smile. The interaction was brief, but afterward she whispered to her companions, "I thought he would strike me. Instead, he helped." The contradiction gnawed at them daily, forcing them to unlearn what they had believed unshakable. Not all moments were gentle. The women were prisoners still, watched constantly, their movements restricted. The fences reminded them of that with every glance, and the guards' rifles were never far. But cruelty did not define the place. Instead, what defined it was the strange blend of abundance and restraint, as if the Americans had decided victory was best expressed not in punishment, but in proof of their own strength. Feeding the enemy, housing them cleanly, allowing them to work. These became subtle demonstrations of power, gestures that said, "We are strong enough to be merciful." One afternoon, the women were gathered in the yard as American soldiers tossed a baseball between them, their laughter rising in the warm air. The women watched, transfixed by the ease of it. Their own brothers had played with wooden bats and scraps of cloth wound into balls before the war, but here the game seemed effortless, part of the daily life of men untouched by hunger. The clerk whispered, "It is like watching another world." She was right. For the prisoners, the camp was less a cage than a mirror reflecting how different their worlds had been. The nurse from Saipan found herself studying the faces of the guards when they thought no one was watching. They were sunburned, sometimes freckled, their jaws square, their teeth startlingly white compared to the malnourished men she had nursed in the field hospitals. She thought of her fiancé, who had gone to sea in 1943 and never returned. He had been thin, his skin sallow, his shoulders narrow from lack of food. The men before her now looked like giants. She hated herself for noticing, yet she could not stop. The contrast was a wound that would not heal. Letters arrived for the Americans, delivered in neat stacks. The women watched the soldiers unfold envelopes, smile, sometimes wipe away tears before tucking photographs into breast pockets. Family seemed close for them, present even across oceans. For the Japanese women, family was memory only, fading and unreachable. That divide felt sharper than the fences. And yet, despite sorrow, small connections bloomed. When a woman thanked a soldier in broken English for extra soap, he replied with exaggerated politeness, tipping his cap as if addressing a lady. She laughed despite herself, the first time laughter had escaped her since capture. Another day, when a storm swept through the camp, the guards rushed to secure windows and roofs, one shouting instructions as though protecting his own home. The women helped too, hauling what they could, surprised at the shared urgency. For a brief span, captor and captive worked side by side against the wind, and afterward the memory lingered. Reports from the International Red Cross noted the unusual fairness of American POW camps, contrasting them with the brutal records of Japanese camps across Asia. The women did not see the reports, but they lived the truth of them. In their daily routines, soap, bread, clean sheets, they experienced a world turned upside down. Kindness itself became disorienting. Some lay awake at night, asking if it was a trick, if the cruelty would come later. Others whispered that perhaps Americans were not what they had been told at all. The days lengthened, and the shock softened into uneasy familiarity. The women learned the rhythms of camp life, the taste of white bread, the warmth of hot showers, the sound of baseballs smacking into gloves. Yet beneath this new normal pulsed a constant question. What did it mean that their enemy treated them better than their own army sometimes had? If war had been built on lies, what truths were left to trust? One evening, as dusk painted the sky in purple light, the nurse lingered near the fence, staring at the guards silhouetted against the fading sun. Their laughter carried across the yard, careless, alive. She felt a pang deep in her chest, not just of loss but of something harder to name, a recognition that the world was larger, more complicated, than she had ever believed. She pressed her hand against the rough wood of the barracks wall, steadying herself, as the thought formed unbidden, perhaps the true captivity was not these fences, but the lies she had carried into them. And yet, as night fell, a new rumor spread among the women, whispered words that promised the next day would bring something even stranger, a revelation that would unsettle them more than bread, more than soap, more than even the sight of handsome guards. They lay awake in their bunks, listening to the distant murmur of American voices, hearts racing at what they might discover when dawn arrived. Winter settled over the camp, softening the edges of the barracks with frost, muting the clang of gates with snow. The women wrapped themselves in issued coats, their breath rising in pale clouds, and walked the yard where guards now stamped their boots to keep warm. It had been months since they had arrived, months since the ship first revealed the shock of tall American soldiers on the dock. In that time, their fear had dulled into a sharper, more complicated awareness. They were still prisoners, still bound by fences, but they had begun to see the men around them less as faceless enemies and more as young lives parallel to their own. The nurse often lingered by the kitchen window, watching soldiers unload sacks of flour or crates of apples. She thought of her fiancé, lost to the sea, and felt a grief made heavier by the vitality of the men before her. They whistled while they worked, tossed apples between them as if the world had never burned. She could not decide if the sight was comforting or unbearable. Her heart wrestled with contradictions. Hatred taught by war, gratitude awakened by survival, and a strange, reluctant admiration for the enemy who had not crushed them but fed them. Evenings in the barracks became quieter, though whispers still wove through the dark. One woman admitted she dreamed of her captors, not nightmares of cruelty, but dreams in which they were simply men, their laughter echoing through the yard. Another confessed that she no longer knew whether to cling to the anger drilled into her or to acknowledge the kindness she had tasted in bread and soap. Shame lingered in their voices, but so did relief. The transformation was slow, almost invisible, yet it reshaped the air they breathed. The Americans, too, seemed changed. Some guards had first treated the women with stiff formality, wary of proximity. Over time, small gestures broke through. A soldier sketched clumsy flowers on scraps of paper and left them near the laundry hut. Another taught one woman a few words of English, "Good morning," "Thank you," and laughed when she repeated them awkwardly. These were not grand acts of friendship, only fragments of humanity that pierced the barrier of war. The women carried them like secret treasures. Official reports noted the unusual civility of such camp. The International Red Cross, in visits during 1945 and 1946, wrote of American compliance with the Geneva Convention, contrasting it starkly with accounts of Japanese camps where disease and brutality were common. The women did not read these documents, but they lived the truth daily. Each bar of soap, each plate of food, each simple kindness stood as evidence against the propaganda that had shaped their world. The lies of the past crumbled quietly, replaced by experiences they could not deny. Yet the transformation was not without pain. Each revelation of American strength, well-fed bodies, clean uniforms, laughter that came easily, was also a reminder of Japan's ruin. Their homeland lay in ashes. Families struggled to eat. Brothers and fathers had died gaunt and broken. To see their captors thrive while their own kin perished was an agony difficult to bear. The women carried that grief like a second skin. Gratitude for kindness lived beside resentment for defeat, both heavy, both true. The nurse once stood by the fence as a guard wrote a letter home. His pencil scratched steadily, his lips moving slightly with each word. When he paused, staring off toward the horizon, she wondered who he wrote to. A wife? A sweetheart? A mother? She thought of the letters she would never write, the faces she would never see again. A bitter truth struck her. This man, her captor, might know more joy and peace in his lifetime than her fiancé ever had. She turned away quickly, but the thought lingered, haunting. Seasons turned, and the war's echo softened into memory. The women began to mark time less by fear and more by small rituals. They swept their barracks, folded their uniforms with care, tended to each other when illness struck. Some worked in the camp gardens, planting rows of vegetables under the watchful eyes of guards. For them, touching soil again felt like touching life. It gave rhythm to days that otherwise blurred. And always, above the routine, lingered the tall figures of American soldiers, living proof that the world was not what they had been told. One afternoon, a soldier carried a phonograph into the yard. He cranked it, and music poured out, swing rhythms brassy and alive. The women froze, startled by the strange, infectious sound. Some smiled despite themselves. A few guards clapped in time, joking with one another. The nurse closed her eyes, listening, and felt tears burn at the corners. Music, of all things, reminded her that joy still existed, even in captivity. It was almost cruel in its beauty. Yet it etched itself into her memory as a moment when the walls of enmity cracked wide enough to let something human slip through. By spring, whispers of release began to spread. The war was long over, and repatriation loomed. For many women, the thought of returning to Japan was bittersweet. They longed for home, yet feared what home had become. News filtered in of rubble, hunger, and grief. To leave the camp meant to face a nation reshaped by defeat. Strangely, for some, the fences no longer felt only like prison, they felt like shelter from a harsher reality waiting beyond. When the day of departure drew near, the women gathered their belongings. They folded their coats, tied bundles, and lined up once again for transport. The nurse looked back at the camp one final time. The barracks stood quietly, the fences still tall, the guards still watching. Yet in her memory, it was not the fences that remained sharp. It was the smell of bacon in the mornings, the hot showers, the polite gestures, the tall soldiers tossing a baseball in the sun. These details would travel with her long after the gates closed behind her. As the trucks rumbled toward the port, the women whispered to each other, not of monsters but of men. They looked like film stars, one said again, this time without shame. Another added softly, they treated us better than we expected. The nurse remained silent, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She felt a shift inside her, not toward love or admiration, but toward something heavier, the knowledge that truth had been more complicated than she had ever believed. War had been built on lies, but in captivity she had glimpsed something undeniable. At the harbor, the ships waited, gray hulks ready to return them to the ashes of Japan. The women climbed aboard, their satchels clutched, their hearts torn. Behind them, America receded, a land of contradiction, of defeat and unexpected mercy, of tall, handsome men who had shattered every story they had been told. As the ship's engines roared to life, the nurse pressed her hands together and whispered a prayer, not for victory, not for revenge, but for understanding. She did not yet know what awaited in her homeland, but she knew one truth would remain with her forever. The enemy had looked into her eyes and treated her as human. And that memory, both painful and luminous, would not fade. H.